In the spring of 2009, a dairy scientist named Royce Hale stood at a wire fence in Tillamook County, Oregon, looked at the milky water pooling in the ditch on the other side, and said the word that would follow Calvin Boyd for the next 14 years. He said it kindly. He said it the way a man says a thing he is certain of, which is to say without any cruelty at all. He looked at the runoff sheeting off the cheese plant's holding pond. The water Calvin had been catching at his property line for 3 seasons by then, and he called it waste. What he meant was specific. Whey, the thin, watery liquid left over when milk is curdled into cheese, was, to a man like Royce, a disposal problem. Every 100 pounds of milk that became cheese left behind roughly 85 pounds of whey, and a plant the size of the one above Calvin's fence made tens of thousands of pounds of it every single day. It had to go somewhere. Mostly it went into ponds and ditches, and when the regulators were not looking, into the creek. Royce had a doctorate in food science and a job advising the plant on exactly this, and he told Calvin, standing at that fence, that the stuff was a liability with no value anyone had figured out how to capture. 14 years later, a buyer for a national beauty retailer would sit in a small office in Tillamook and read a number off a purchase order out loud, and the number would be $610,000. One order. From the waste at the fence. This is the story of the years between those 2 sentences, and of a man who knew something about milk that the man with the doctorate did not. Let me tell you about Calvin Boyd, because the dismissal does not land unless you understand who was being dismissed. He was 51 that spring, a wide, quiet man with a bad left knee from a tractor rollover in his 20s and hands that had been in milk and brine and lye soap his whole life. He had grown up on the 80 acres his grandmother left him, a parcel too small and too wet to run as a real dairy by 2009 standards, tucked into a fold of the Coast Range where the fog came in off the ocean every morning and did not always leave. He was known for 2 things in that valley. He almost never spoke first, and he could fix or build anything that involved a tank, a pump, or a slow chemical reaction, because his grandmother had taught him to make soap before he could read. That last part matters more than anything, Royce Hale knew, so hold on to it. The cheese plant sat on the hill above Calvin's north fence, a sprawling, stainless operation that had bought up the surrounding ground over the decades and now pressed right against his line. When they expanded the curd rooms in 2006, they put in a new holding pond for processed water, and they sited it badly. And every spring, when the rains came, the pond overtopped at one low corner and sent a steady, milky trickle down across the property boundary. Calvin watched it for 1 season. The second season, he dug a catch basin at the fence and lined it with the same food-grade liner he used for his brine tanks. The third season, the spring Royce came down to look, he was catching close to 400 gallons a day of it. Royce had come because someone at the plant had finally noticed a neighbor was collecting their discharge and wanted to know if it was a problem. He was a decent man. I want to be plain about that, because the easy version of this story makes him a fool. And he was not a fool. He was an intelligent person who had built an entire career on a single true fact, which is that whey is mostly water and lactose and a little protein, and that capturing value from it at scale requires equipment that costs more than the whey is worth. He had run those numbers 100 times for 100 plants. The numbers were correct. They were correct for the question he was asking. "You're catching our waste stream," Royce said, leaning on the fence post, not unfriendly. I'll be honest with you, Mr. Boyd. There's nothing in there. It's a disposal cost for us, not a product. We'd dry it for whey protein if the math worked, but the math doesn't work at our volume, let alone yours. You're collecting a liability. Calvin looked at the basin, then back at Royce. It's not the protein I'm after, he said. Royce waited for more, the way an expert waits for a layman to reveal the depth of his confusion. He was a patient man, and he had given this same explanation to dairymen and county officials and reporters, and it always landed the same way, with the layman nodding slowly as the science settled the question. He gestured at the basin with the easy authority of a man who had measured 10,000 gallons of the stuff. I've run the lab work on this exact discharge, Mr. Boyd. Lactose, a little protein, a lot of water. The protein's too dilute to pull at any price that makes sense. Whatever you think is in there. The analysis is the analysis. I'm telling you this as a favor. Don't put money into it. Calvin did not give him any more. He picked up his bucket and walked back toward the low building behind his house, Pearl falling into step at his bad knee, and Royce stood at the fence a moment longer with the mild puzzlement of a man whose favor has not been received, then drove his clean white plant truck back up the hill. That was the first time the word waste got used at that fence. It would not be the last. Let me tell you what was actually in that basin, because this is where the two kinds of knowing split apart and walk in opposite directions for 14 years. Royce saw whey and thought protein, because protein was the thing his industry had learned to extract and sell. Calvin saw whey and thought lactic acid, lactose, and a living culture of bacteria, because his grandmother had made soap and skin salve from clabbered milk and buttermilk her entire life, and Calvin had grown up watching the way that fermented milk acids ate the rough dead skin off a working man's hands and left them, somehow softer than before. The chemistry has a plain name. The acids in soured milk are alpha-hydroxy acids, lactic acid chief among them, and they do gently what expensive cosmetic chemicals do harshly. They loosen the bond between dead surface skin cells and the living skin beneath. The cheese plant's waste pond was, to anyone who had made soap from soured milk, a slow tank of dilute lactic acid and milk sugars culturing quietly in the spring cool. Let me explain the mechanism the way Opal explained it to a boy who could not yet read, because it is not magic and it is not nostalgia, it is chemistry that works whether or not anyone has a degree to name it. Skin sheds its top layer constantly. Dead flat cells held together by a kind of biological glue. On a man who works in cold and lye and water all day, that dead layer thickens and cracks, and the glue holds the rough plates in place long past their use. Lactic acid, even weak, dissolves that glue at the surface, a little at a time, so the dead skin lifts away on its own instead of being scrubbed off. The skin underneath, younger and softer, comes up to meet the air. Drugstore chemistry does the same thing with glycolic acid that bites fast and stings. Soured milk does it slow and mild because the acid is dilute and buffered by the milk sugars around it, and the milk fat that rides along leaves the surface, conditioned instead of stripped. Opal had known the result for 50 years before any laboratory put a name on the cause. She did not know the word for the glue between the cells. She knew that buttermilk left her hands like a girl's, and she had built a livelihood on knowing it. To the plant, it was effluent. To Calvin, it was the exact raw material his grandmother had paid good money for in jars, 30 years dead now and still teaching him from the cardboard box of her papers in his back room. That box is the second thing to hold on to. His grandmother, Opal, had kept a soap ledger, a fat, water-stained composition book where she wrote every batch she ever made from 1947 forward. The weights, the cure times, the way a given lot of milk behaved, the customers up and down the coast who bought her bars and her hand salve by the case. Calvin had read it so many times the spine had given out, and he kept it now in a freezer bag. On one of the late pages, in her cramped hand, she had written a sentence he repeated to himself more than he repeated anything else. "The milk that's no good for drinking is the best milk there is." She meant soured milk. "Clabber the stuff a dairy threw to the hogs," she had been saying, in her way, the whole thesis of his life. The thing the system throws away is not the same as the thing that has no worth. He did not say any of this to Royce Hale. He almost never said things to anyone. What he did, through 2009 and 2010, was build. He took the cot Whey and he ran it slow through a process he worked out from Opal's ledger and from 2 years of failed batches in 5-gallon buckets behind the house. He let the wild lactic cultures already in the pond water do most of the work, concentrating the acids by careful evaporation in shallow stainless pans, under the same coast fog that kept the temperature low and steady. He learned that the spring Whey, caught cold, made a clearer, milder acid than the summer Whey, which fermented too fast and turned. He learned to test the pH with strips and then, when he could afford it, with a meter, and he locked in a target, an acidity he could hit batch after batch. He turned a waste stream that varied wildly into a standardized ingredient. That word, standardized, is the one Royce would have respected if Royce had ever come back down the hill to look. He did not. For a long time, the failures were not quick. The first summer, he tried to concentrate the Whey too fast, with a little heat from a propane ring, and he scorched the milk sugars, and the whole batch came out brown and bitter and useless, 40 gallons poured back into the ditch it came from. The second failure taught him patience. He learned that the fog was not a nuisance to work around, but the tool itself, a steady cool that let the shallow pans give up their water over days without ever cooking what was left. He built a low, open-sided shed at the fence line, so the pans could sit in the marine air out of the rain, and he turned them by hand, morning and evening, the way Opal had turned her curing soap, and he wrote down the weather every day next to the pH, the way she had written it next to her batches. Pearl learned the rounds with him, trotting the line of pans, and on the cold mornings she would lie in the one patch of sun the shed allowed, and watch him work. Somewhere in the second year, he stopped guessing and started knowing. A man who has poured 40 gallons of his own failure back into a ditch does not forget what the failure looked like, and the not forgetting is the whole of the craft. Let me tell you about the granddaughter, because every story like this one has a young person who comes home certain that the old person is wrong. Her name was Devon. She was Calvin's brother's girl, and she came to live with Calvin in the fall of 2014, 23 years old, with a freshly printed degree in chemistry from Oregon State, and no job in a recession that had not really ended for inland Oregon. She loved her uncle, and she was embarrassed by him in roughly equal measure, the way the educated young are embarrassed by the people who raised them. She walked the property the first week, and she found the shallow pans and the buckets in the basin at the fence, and she did the same arithmetic Royce had done, because they had taught her the same arithmetic. "Uncle Cal," she said, standing in the doorway of the back room with Opal's ledger open in her hands, "this is soured industrial effluent. You're making hand soap out of a cheese plant's drainage ditch. You know that, right?" "I know where it comes from," Calvin said. "That's not a business. That's a hobby, a weird one." She was not trying to be cruel either. She was trying to save him from himself, which is its own kind of arrogance, the kind that comes free with a diploma. You could get sick. You could get someone else sick. There's no testing. There's no consistency. There's no, and she gestured at the pans, there's no anything. This is folk wisdom in a bucket. She had spent 4 years learning to trust instruments over hands, controls over intuition, the published method over the thing the old people did because their mothers had done it. That training was not wrong. It had built the modern world. What it had not taught her was its own edge, the place where a system that measures only what it knows how to measure goes blind to everything else. And she was standing at that edge now, without knowing it, looking at her uncle's pans and seeing only the absence of everything her education had taught her to look for. She could not yet see the presence of the thing. It had not folk wisdom in a bucket. That was the second time, and it came from the person he loved most in the world, and he did not argue. He handed her a bar of the soap he had cured the previous winter, and he told her to use it for a month and then tell him it was a hobby. Then he went back to the pans. The dog, an old blue heeler named Pearl, who followed Calvin from tank to tank all day and slept across the doorway of the back room every night, lifted her head, looked at Devon, and put it back down. Now, let me tell you what was happening up the hill at the same time, because Calvin was not the only one with a plan in those years. His nearest neighbor on the Valley Road was a younger dairyman named Wendell Tate, who had taken over his own family's operation in 2011 and decided to do it the way the magazines and the extension office and Royce Hale all agreed it should be done. Wendell was not a foolish man. He was ambitious and hopeful, and he read everything, and everything told him the same thing. Get big or get out. Push your herd's volume. Finance the efficiency. In 2013, he borrowed against the whole place to build a freestall barn and put in a high production system, and he signed a milk contract with the same cooperative that supplied the cheese plant, a contract priced on volume. He was by every measure the system used, doing it right. For a few years he looked like the smartest man in the valley, and Calvin looked like a man making soap out of a ditch. Let me put real numbers on Wendell's path, because the sympathy this story owes him is the sympathy you owe a man who did everything correctly and was punished for it. He borrowed $400,000 in 2013 against land his family had owned free and clear for 60 years. He doubled his herd to 140 head of high-yield Holsteins, animals bred to convert feed into milk, at a rate that would have astonished his grandfather, and he bought the feed and the silage and the veterinary contracts that such animals require. Because a cow built to produce that much milk is a finely tuned engine that fails the moment the inputs slip. His monthly note ran near $3,800. To carry it, he needed every cow milking near the top of her capacity every single day, which meant the whole operation lived inside a narrow band of conditions: the right feed, the right temperature, the right price with no slack anywhere in it. Slack is an efficiency, and the system had taught him to squeeze the slack out. He had squeezed out the very thing that lets a farm survive a bad year. Nobody told him that, because the people advising him had never seen the year that tests it. Wendell came by Calvin's place in 2015, friendly, a little pitying, leaning on the truck. "You ought to come work for me, Cal," he said. "I could use a man who can keep equipment running, this soap thing." He shook his head, smiling. "It's a museum, what you're doing down here. It's a nice museum, but the money's in volume now. 3 voices, 3 registers, and they all said the same thing without ever comparing notes. A liability, a hobby, a museum." The Valley had decided what Calvin Boyd was, and Calvin let it, because he had a basin full of spring whey, and a granddaughter who had stopped saying the soap was a hobby somewhere around the third week of using it. That was the turn. Devon used the bar for a month the way he'd told her to, and her hands, which had been cracked at the knuckles since a teenage job washing dishes, went smooth in a way no drugstore lotion had ever managed. She did not tell him right away. What she did, being her grandmother's kind of person, whether she knew it yet or not, was take a sample of his concentrated whey acid into the OSU lab where she still had a friend with bench access and run it properly. She had expected to find contamination, inconsistency, a mess. She found a clean, stable, dilute lactic acid solution at a remarkably consistent concentration, low bacterial load, the cultures long since acidified into dormancy. She found, in plain terms, a cosmetic-grade ingredient made for free out of the thing the cheese plant paid to dispose of. "How consistent is it?" she asked him that night at the kitchen table, Opal's ledger between them, Pearl under the table with her chin on Calvin's boot. "Batch to batch." Calvin turned a page. "I hold it inside 1/10 of a point of pH. Spring caught summer. I throw out. You want to see the log?" She wanted to see the log. He had been keeping one for 6 years, a ledger of his own in the back of Opal's book. Every batch dated and measured. The hobby had records older than some companies. She sat up most of that night reading it, and somewhere in those pages the embarrassed chemistry graduate turned into something else, a partner, though neither of them said the word. Let me tell you about the next 3 years quickly, because they were slow to live, and they matter mostly for what they built. Devon brought the rigor the operation had lacked, and Calvin already had the thing she could not have learned in school, which was the feel of the material across seasons and weather. She set up real testing. She designed labels and a simple registration with the state. She insisted they stop calling it soap, because the soap was the least of it. The real product was the concentrated lactic acid serum and a line of milk acid creams built around it, and she had the sense to position them not as cheap, but as rare, made in small batches on the Oregon coast from a single source, which happened to be true and happened to also be the most expensive-sounding thing they could have said. They argued in those years the good arguments of two people who have started to trust each other. Devon wanted to buy a small reverse osmosis unit to concentrate the whey faster and free Calvin from the slow fog evaporation. Calvin let her run the numbers and then walked her out to the pans on a cold morning and had her taste 2 samples. One made his slow whey and one she had run through a borrowed membrane. The fast one was thinner, sharper, a little flat. The slow one had a roundness to it she could measure on no instrument she owned. She put the reverse osmosis brochure in a drawer and did not bring it up again. It was the first time she understood in her own mouth that the feel Calvin had was not superstition but information, gathered by a sense the lab had never taught her to use. After that, she stopped trying to make the operation faster and started trying to make it legible, which was the thing it actually needed. A way to prove on paper what Calvin already knew in his hands. They sold the first real batch in 2017 at a farmer's market in Portland. They sold out by noon. A woman who ran a small chain of spa boutiques bought their entire remaining stock off the table and asked for a standing wholesale order. By 2019, they had turned the old milking parlor into a clean production room, and Devon had quit pretending she was going to find another job. Calvin had 4 people working for him by then, all from the valley. 2 of them, Wendell Tate's former dairy hands, though Calvin never made anything of that. Which brings us back up the hill and to the year the weather settled. The argument the way weather always eventually does. The summer of 2021 brought the heat dome to the Pacific Northwest. The last week of June, Tillamook County, which never broke 90, broke 110 degrees 3 days running. Let me tell you what that does to a high-production dairy, because the numbers are the story. A modern high-yield cow, pushed to the volume Wendell's contract demanded, runs hot already. Her own metabolism is a furnace. In normal coast weather, the marine air carries the heat off. In a heat dome, there is no marine air. Wendell's freestall barn, built for efficiency and airflow in a climate that no longer reliably existed, could not move enough air. His herd's milk production collapsed by nearly 40% in a week, and he lost 11 head outright, animals worth $2,000 apiece, that he was still paying the bank for. His volume-priced contract, the one that had made him look smart, paid him nothing extra for the catastrophe and penalized him for missing his committed volume. The efficient system, optimized for one narrow set of conditions, met a condition outside the set and broke. The thing about a tuned engine is that it has no give. Wendell's 140 head needed to eat and be cooled and milked on a schedule that assumed the weather would behave. And when the weather stopped behaving, there was nothing in the operation to absorb the blow. He ran hoses over the barn roof and rented fans that pulled the last of his cash, and still the animals went down in the heat. The highest producers first, because they were the ones running hottest. A cow built to make 60 pounds of milk a day cannot shed the heat of making 60 pounds of milk a day when the air is 110 and dead still. By the time the dome broke, he had spent $11,000. He did not have on emergency cooling, lost the 11 animals, and watched his surviving herd's production stay depressed for the rest of the summer, because heat-stressed cows do not simply bounce back. The bank did not adjust the note. The cooperative did not adjust the penalty. Every part of the system that had urged him toward volume looked away when the volume could not be made. That is the quiet cruelty of an optimized system. It rewards you in the good years as if the good years were your doing, and it abandons you in the bad year, as if the bad year were your fault. Calvin's 80 wet acres, the parcel too small and too marshy to be a real dairy, held their fog 2 of the 3 days and lost it on the 3rd. He had no high-production herd to cook. What he had was a basin of whey that fermented a little fast in the heat, and a granddaughter who threw out 2 days of summer catch without being told to. The shock that broke the optimized operation up the hill barely registered down at the fence. That is the whole thing told in one summer. Efficiency is a bet that conditions will stay inside the range you optimized for. Resilience is what you have left when that bet loses. Royce Hale was still consulting for the cheese plant in 2021. He came down the Valley Road that August, not to Calvin's place, but to Wendell's, to advise on the herd losses, and on the way back up, he passed the old milking parlor with its new clean windows and the small, tasteful sign Devon had hung, and he slowed the truck. He had heard the way you hear things in a small county, that Boyd was selling some kind of lotion. He did not stop. The 3rd dismissal was the smallest and the quietest. He told the plant manager that afternoon, by way of explaining why he hadn't looked into it, that it was a boutique thing, a little local liability waiting to happen, and not worth the plant's attention. A boutique liability. The 4th time the word came, the same root word, 14 years after the first, and this time the man saying it was driving past the proof without recognizing it. Let me tell you about the day the number came, because it came the way these numbers do, quietly, off a piece of paper, in a room too small for what it meant. In the spring of 2023, a senior buyer for a national beauty retailer flew into Portland and drove out to the coast. because a product development director at her company had become obsessed with a milk acid serum she'd found in a Portland spa. The buyer's name was Marisol, and she was the qualified outside judge. This story had been waiting 14 years to send. She had spent 20 years sorting real ingredients from marketing, and she could not be impressed by a story, only by a material. She walked Calvin's clean production room. She read his log, Opal's log, the 14 years of pH held inside a tenth of a point. She held a vial of the spring-caught serum up to the window light and looked at it for a long time without saying anything. Then she asked one question. Can you guarantee this exact concentration, this exact source 12 months a year, at 10 times this volume, without changing one thing about how you make it? Calvin thought about the spring whey and the summer whey he threw out. He thought about the size of the basin, and the size of his 80 acres, and the simple physical limit of how much spring fog there was. No, he said, I can guarantee it at about 3 times this spring caught only. After that, it stops being what it is. Marisol set the vial down. In her 20 years, she had heard 1,000 suppliers promise her infinite volume, and every one of those promises had been a lie that cost her company later. She had never once heard a supplier tell her the true ceiling of his own product to his own face. She did not negotiate the price. She told him what her company would pay for the maximum he could honestly make. The spring run every drop exclusive, the purchase order printed in the little office off the production room. Devon picked it up off the tray. Pearl, gray-muzzled now and slow, 14 years older than the day she'd watched Devon stand in the doorway calling it a hobby, lifted her head from the cool concrete. Devon read the number out loud. $610,000. The room was very quiet. It landed harder than a bigger number would have, because everyone in that room knew exactly what it was made of. It was made of the water that had been pooling in a ditch since 2009. It was made of a sentence in a dead woman's ledger about milk that was no good for drinking. It was made of 14 springs of a wide, quiet man holding a number inside a tenth of a point, while 3 confident voices called what he was doing a hobby, museum, a liability. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Devon set the paper down on the desk as carefully as if it might bruise. Outside the window, the fog was coming in, off the ocean the way it did every afternoon, the same fog that had cooled the same pans for 14 years, indifferent to the number having made it. The serum on the shelf caught the gray light. The whole arithmetic of a life sat in that silence, and the silence was the right response to it, because some numbers are too heavy to put words on top of. Calvin did not say anything. He almost never said anything. He reached down and put his hand on the old dog's head. Marisol asked before she left where the raw material came from, because the exclusivity contract required her to know the source. Devon took her up the hill and showed her the cheese plant's overflow corner and the basin at the fence. Marisol stood there a while. They throw this away, she said. It was not a question. Devon said they paid to throw it away. Marisol shook her head once and got in her car. Let me tell you what happened to Royce Hale, because the niche this story belongs to does not let the expert off the hook, but it does not crush him either. He found out the way everyone found out, when the buyer's company put out a release about a new serum sourced from a single Oregon farm, and a trade reporter, charmed by the story, called the cheese plant for comment about their unusual neighbor. The plant manager, baffled, handed the call to Royce. Royce drove down the valley road that week, and he stopped this time, and he stood at the same wire fence where he had said the word waste in 2009. And he looked at the basin, and he understood all at once the size of the thing he had been right and wrong about for 14 years. Calvin came out. They had not spoken since that first spring. Royce, to his credit, did not make excuses. He was a sincere man who had been wrong, and being wrong in front of a fact is a thing a sincere man can survive. "I told you there was nothing in it," he said. "There wasn't," Calvin said. "Not the thing you were looking for." Royce asked if he could see how it was done. Not as a consultant, as a man who wanted to understand what he had missed. And Calvin, who had every right in the world to send him back up the hill, opened the gate instead. The strongest version of the correction is not the doubter humbled, it is the doubter taught. Royce spent 3 afternoons that fall in the production room, and the food scientist who had spent his career proving the whey was worthless ended up writing, on his own time, the careful chemical documentation. The credential finally found its proper use in service of the knowledge it had once dismissed. Let me tell you how it ended, which is to say how it kept going, because nothing here ended. Calvin and Devin did the thing the system would never have advised. They did not scale. They could have taken outside money and built a plant and chased Marisol's 10 times volume and ruined the exact thing that made the serum worth $600,000 a season. Calvin had watched Wendell Tate do that with cows. He was not going to do it with whey. They held the operation to the spring run and the 80 acres and the basin at the fence. And they paid off the small debts they had, and Calvin gave Wendell, who had sold his cooked-out herd and was looking for a way to keep his land. Wendell ran the production room. Now, the man who had called it a museum kept the museum running. The method spread the only way Calvin would let it. Other dairies up and down the coast had the same waste problem and the same ditches, and Calvin and Devin taught them for a fair fee how to catch and culture and concentrate their own spring whey on the condition that nobody flooded the market and cheapened the thing. A dozen small operations on the Oregon and Washington coast make Milk Acid Skincare, now a quiet cooperative of former waste streams. And it started at one fence in Tillamook County. Devin formalized Opal's ledger and her own 14 years of additions into a real manual, and she keeps the original composition book, spine long gone, in its freezer bag in a drawer in the office. The teaching was its own kind of careful. Calvin would not sell the manual to anyone who would not first stand at the pans through a full spring with him, because the words on the page were only half of it, and the other half lived in the weather and the hands. He turned away 2 investors who wanted to license the process and run it at scale in a warehouse with heat and membranes, because he knew exactly what that would make the thin, sharp, flat version Devin had tasted and put back in the drawer. He sold the knowledge to neighbors and kept it from corporations, which is the opposite of what every business advisor he never hired would have told him to do. The first dairy he taught was a struggling goat operation 2 valleys over, run by a widow named Ruth who had been about to sell out. Her spring whey, cultured the way Calvin showed her, carried her through. She sent Devin a card every spring after that, and Devin kept them in the drawer next to the ledger because they were part of the record too. On the last page, Opal wrote the sentence Calvin had carried his whole life. The milk that's no good for drinking is the best milk there is. Here's what I think this story is actually about, now that you have all of it. There are 2 kinds of knowing. One is wide and fast and confident, and it measures what is easy to measure. It knew that whey was 85% water and a little protein, and it was right, and it threw the rest away because the rest did not fit on the spreadsheet. The other kind is narrow and slow and quiet, and it knows one piece of ground or one material so completely that it sees what the wide knowing cannot. It knew that soured milk softens a working man's hands because it had watched that happen for 70 years across 2 women and 1 man. And no instrument the first kind of knowing owned could measure that. So the first kind of knowing called it a hobby. The system measured the protein and missed the acid. It measured the volume and missed the resilience. It measured everything that was easy and called the rest waste. And the word waste turned out to mean only this: we have not yet learned what it is for. Wendell got big and the heat came, and the bigness was the danger. Calvin stayed small, and the heat came, and the smallness was the safety. Royce had the credential, and the credential could not see the thing in front of his own fence until the thing had a price on it. And then the credential, to its honor, bent down to learn. The buyer who could not be moved by a story was moved by a man telling her the true limit of what he could make. Calvin Boyd is 65 now. He still does not speak first. He still tests every spring batch himself, inside 1/10 of a point, the way he has since before any of it had a name. The cheese plant still makes its way, and most of it still goes into ponds and ditches, because most of the world has still not learned the lesson of the fence, and that is fine. There is enough at one fence. He has been offered more than once the chance to put his name on a national line, to franchise the method, to become the kind of success the magazines write about, and each time he has said no, the way he says most things, quietly and once. Devon stopped relaying the offers years ago. She knows the answer. In the evenings, he sits on the porch, and the fog comes in off the ocean the way it has every evening of his life, and a young blue heeler, Pearl's granddaughter, lies across his boots where the old dog used to lie. Devon runs the place now in everything but name. The ledger is in its drawer. The basin is full of spring. What a system values and what is truly valuable are 2 different things, and the gap between them is where the patient people live,